everybody, it's Eugene Lisho, and welcome to another episode of Forensics Talks. This is episode 43. Just a couple of things before we get started as usual. And first one is I love to know where people are from. So by all means, don't forget that there is a comments section here. So go ahead, type in where you're from. And don't forget that you can comment or ask questions during the guest interview. And then what I'm going to try to do on the back end, if there's any decent questions, I'm going to go ahead and offer them up. And we'll see if we can get those answered for you. I do have one announcement, and this is a pretty big one for me, and that is that today, I just announced this morning, that I'm going to be hosting a forensic photography symposium. And this is going to happen on January 17th to 20th, 2022. And the idea here is to bring together experts from all over the world who are really focused in the discipline of forensic photography. And this could be for crash scenes, it could be for crime scenes, it could be for autopsies, it could be for fire investigation, whatever. And the focus is really on trying to solve problems in forensic photography, whether it's UV, whether it's something that chemical luminescence, whether it's infrared, a whole number of different things that are sort of very specific. And we have some really great speakers and a number of things that we're going to be covering, including like a networking session. We're getting vendors and sponsors to talk about their technology. And I think it's going to be a great event. I'm super excited about it. And so the information is here. You can just go to the website here. If you just go to my main website, ai2-3d.com, you'll definitely see the link there. Just pop on and you can go from there. Okay, great. Let me move on from here and let's jump right into this. And so my guest today is René Gapert, and René is an independent consultant, forensic anthropologist and human remains specialist in Ireland. He trained as a medical dissector, prosector in anatomy, pathology, and forensic medicine in Berlin, Heidelberg, and Dusseldorf. He also pursued doctoral research studies in forensic anthropology and human anatomy at University College Dublin in Ireland, and he has over 20 years of experience in the dissection of the structures of the human body and the examination and analysis of human remains in forensic and historical context. René has assisted in various cases involving examinations of mummified, decomposed, burned, and skeletonized remains. Internationally, he's worked with the Institute of Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences in Berlin, with the Berlin Police in skeletal remains analysis, the Australian government in the analysis of indigenous remains, and the Buchenwald Memorial Center in Weimar doing bone analyses. He's currently working on multidisciplinary research in forensic anthropology, human anatomy, and human identification, and he's published over 18 peer-reviewed research papers and case histories. And I found him online because he posts quite a bit. He's a very active poster, and he has some really great content. So let me bring in here. Hey, René, how you doing?
Hello, Eugene, and thank you very much for inviting me to this talk today. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, the first thing I always like to find out about people is if they were always forensic anthropologists or they're little experts when they were children. Were you always digging in the sand looking for bones, or what kind of a kid were you?
Well, probably not quite like that, but yes, there was maybe something. Something was showing quite early. Because as a kid, I was always fascinated by these little keyring skeletons and skulls, and I always wanted to have them. And my mother would never allow me to have these kind of stuff at home. So I think that's how it started. But yeah, I think it showed some early signs veering into that direction. Although I had no particular interest in real bones or anything outside of this. I was just fascinated by these figurines and toys,
Right, yeah. And so what was your sort of journey to getting to, this area of forensic anthropology? When you were deciding what you wanted to be, were you thinking about medicine? Were you thinking about a different field?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was always fascinated by forensic anthropology since I read a book that was translated into German, and it was following, the adventures of Dr. Clyde Snow, very famous pioneer of forensic anthropology in the United States. So it fascinated me, but it didn't really at that stage lead to a main interest. I mean, my main interest maybe was more broad, so something that I was looking at was something to do with anatomy or pathology. And we had a very specific training course in Germany, that of the medical dissector or prosector. And it's something similar to, in the UK, to the APT or the anatomical pathology technician. In the US, maybe they are called pathology technicians or pathology assistants. The main work involved the dissection of the structures of the bodies in anatomy, and in pathology, the actual autopsy work, the removal of the organs for the pathologists, and the reconstruction work afterwards. So that was an area. But how did I get into that right after school? Well, actually, while I was still in secondary school, we were able to do a 2-week work placement. And I was the only one in my class or in my school, actually, that went for an internship in the local pathology department.
Okay.
So that was my first introduction to death at the age of 18. So I think it went from there. That was followed by my national service. At that time, Germany had still the national service, and you could join the army or a hospital, wherever you could, or whatever your interest was in serving for 1 year. And I decided I'll see if the pathology department that I did my school internship in would be prepared to give me a year in pathology. And that's what they did. That's how I gained more experience in autopsy techniques. And from then on, I moved to the medical dissector facility in Berlin and trained as a medical dissector afterwards. So that's how it started. So it's very much death and death investigation related, but it's not directly forensic anthropology yet. That's to come.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question, because you've obviously been doing this for some time now. So, if you imagine, if you were to think back when you first started in the field, and think ahead now 20 years or 20 plus years, whatever exactly it is, how has forensic anthropology changed somewhat in definition, or what are some of the major items that stick out in your mind as being sort of like in the past, or what's changed over the 20 years? Let's something to this effect.
I mean, there's definitely some big changes that have taken place. I remember when I started my PhD, I went out to a collection of documented skeletal remains in the UK, in London. And it was a documented collection of crypt remains, and I used these, I used the skulls to develop a method of identifying, or possibly identifying, the biological sex of fragmentary cranial bases using discriminant function analysis. So that was something that required you to actually travel out there to the collection, do the measurements by hand, and also calculate your formulae and everything, and put it all together. Whereas then, I remember moving on then into post-mortem CT scanning. And post-mortem CT scanning is a great help in forensic anthropology. It allows you to look at bodies that might have been compromised but are still covered in soft tissue, and you can virtually remove the soft tissue from the bone, still use your anthropological method, but this time virtually. And so the data collection is it's much more advanced. You can now access collections that are much more contemporary with our populations today.
Right.
And of course, the analysis, the 3D analysis of these remains, it's just so much more advanced. It's a great tool. So that was a big step, the introduction of post-mortem CT scanning, not only for forensic pathology purposes, but for forensic anthropology. I think it's a very big step. And also the differences now in when we apply certain forensic techniques, they're not only based on discriminant functions or logistic regression anymore, at least in the area of biological sex determination, but or ancestry determination. But there are now methods out there that look at shape changes and try to quantify shape changes rather than just the normal metric analysis. So you're looking
Right.
at geometric morphometrics, for example. So that occurred over the time now, over the last 20 years, and came more to the fore. And it's again moved into the area of also utilizing maybe 3D scans or 3D CT scans from remains. So yeah, there are definitely changes, and also where forensic anthropology might be used. My background is anatomy. So, for example, traditionally, a lot of people would come from an archaeological background. Some people come from biology. Some people might come from other, depending on the country they trained in. So I trained from an anatomical background. So I do a lot with remains that are partially still covered, maybe with soft tissue, decomposed, fire damaged bodies,
Right.
or something like this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of changes have happened, and I'm glad they have happened, because now with the methodology now available to the students, it should be I wouldn't say easier, but it should be more straightforward to conduct the data collection and their analysis. And why not? Why make it difficult? And only because we had it difficult in the past doesn't mean that our students have
Right.
to have it difficult nowadays.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
yeah, I think these were the main parts that I concentrated on, the main advancements
Okay.
during my time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you hit on some very good topics there, and some of which I wanted to ask you more about for sure. And when you talk about 3D and CT, like if you know me, then it's music to my ears. It's great to hear that sort of thing, and I think they're fantastic tools. And some of them, like for example, photogrammetry, super low cost. And I always joke around because I say you'll never hear a joke that starts, did you hear about the rich archaeologist that walked into a bar? You know what I mean? These people are underfunded, and you know what I mean. So having low cost tools that allow you to capture things in 3D and that sort of thing are great. But of course, CT is on another level. That is an expensive piece of equipment, but I can see the benefit, especially when mummies and other types of remains. Which actually brings me to a question, and that is that you once said, I think you said that forensic anthropology is the study of recent remains, and then I said, well, how recent is recent? How do you define what is recent?
Well, for our purposes here in the under the Irish legal system, and particularly concerning also the coroners of Ireland here, I think the general cutoff point that has been that the coroners look for is anything that is older than 70 years in a time period. I mean, that's still within living memory, we say. So use a cutoff of 70 years is no longer of forensic interest.
I see.
So that we still have a chance within the 70-year time frame of it doesn't have to be necessarily foul play in these cases. It could be just people who went missing by accident or on purpose, but who didn't meet any the end due to foul play. But there might be family out there that's still looking for them. In criminal cases, of course, there might still be a perpetrator out there that can be pursued. So here in Ireland, there's 70-year time period.
Okay, that's
applies.
interesting. And so different countries would have different laws or rules depending on when they would sort of cut off, hey, this is a forensic case versus something which is more historical.
That's right.
Okay, interesting. Well, let me ask you about Ireland, because you worked there, and one of the things that crossed my mind was geography. And for example, if you're working on a case that is in South Africa versus a case that is in South America, or that is in the Northern Territories or in Ireland, is there anything that you can say about geography and how maybe the geography may affect how you work or what you recover, or something to that effect? I mean, I was in Ireland a few years ago, and was cloudy and rainy most of the time while I was there. But
Well, you were there. Yes. No, I understand. I understand. It has a reputation for being quite wet, but over time you experience all kind of different weathers here. And but yeah, the rain is one of the part that you have these lush green fields,
yeah.
that are so famous. Certainly geography plays a huge role in not only the search and recovery for remains, but also in identifying any kind of taphonomic processes, anything that has altered the remains and how that affects the time since death period or the post-mortem interval. And when we look at any kind of research or taphonomy, anything that we can apply to remains here in Ireland, there's actually very scarce literature that could that actually covers this geographic region. So we're relying a lot on papers or research that comes out of North America or Canada, maybe neighboring countries like Denmark, and also Germany and France and the Netherlands. But something specific here for Ireland is still needed to come up with a very local idea of how remains react to the different conditions here, the different geographic conditions, as well as the environmental conditions. And one of the biggest parts, of course, is Ireland is an island. So you have a lot of water, and you have, of course, also inland water. You have lakes and you have rivers, and a huge amount of changes occur to bodies if they're in these different water environments as well. And that, I think, is something that we need to look a little bit further into, as well as the very specific areas of bog. There's particular boggy areas in Ireland that are unique to the country. So we need to figure out how do, in our case, recent remains react in such an environment to allow us to come up with a better post-mortem interval. And these are all still open questions. There's not much research carried out here in Ireland in these areas.
Interesting. Yeah, there was something else I was going to ask you about, specific to, I believe, Ireland, and that was it was a letter that you had written on. It was like a joint committee on children equality, disability integration. Could you give me some background and maybe talk about that a little? Is that?
Well, it very briefly, it concerned the mother and baby home controversy here in Ireland when it was found that there were graves or the lack of graves, you could say, of for some of the babies and children that died in these mother and baby homes here, and that were, for want of a better word, buried in like underground tank structures rather than a cemetery setting or graveyard setting. And so the question of how to deal with this is ongoing in the government here and also in the public domain. So I'm not very much commenting on this, but my letter just that I sent in, I was worried what was mentioned by the government in looking at these remains, or by the commission that was set up to look into this, is that from retrieval of the remains to DNA testing, and there was no step in between mentioned. And I said, it's not that easy. You cannot just take out the remains and go straight to DNA testing. There have to be proper steps in between, and one of the steps involves the proper cataloging and counting for all the remains that are there, separating them as far as possible into individuals, and then do a targeted DNA test. So my point was not to neglect the subject of forensic anthropology and human identification in this matter, because there is a big lacuna here between the excavation of the remains and the final DNA analysis, and also what is being sent for DNA analysis. So
interesting.
That was my point in the letter, just to make sure that forensic anthropology has its proper place if something is set up to investigate these remains.
In Ireland, are there, or have you worked on anything like mass graves where there's like multiple individuals or a large number? Or maybe I can ask you, what was some of the largest mass graves that you've worked on?
I haven't worked on mass graves,
Okay.
and I think apart from archaeological burials here in Ireland, there are no recent mass mass graves, or there shouldn't. Apart now from the mother and baby homes, there shouldn't be any mass burials really from recent times. But the largest contingent of bodies that involved severely destroyed bodies as well. I mean, I haven't worked on all of them, but I have been taking part and assisted in it. Was the Grenfell Fire Tower.
Okay. Okay. And in that
It
case,
was 72. There were 72 people that were then identified in the end, and that's certainly one of the largest incidents that I had been asked to assist in.
well, I was going to ask you about, because I knew that you had worked on, like, for example, burned remains. And I'm just
Yes.
wondering, what are some of the complications that you run into with burned remains? Because, I mean, I can imagine all kinds of issues.
It completely depends on the scenario, and obviously there are certain approaches that we can take that from experience, certain standard approaches, but each standard approach will change as soon as you work, let's say, even 10-20 minutes into the site, and you have to come up and you have to use your experience
Yeah.
to be able to amend, to make changes to these approaches while not compromising the forensic context, of course. But I've done a few house fires here and in Northern Ireland, and I think the main difficulties are, of course, first and foremost, is the health and safety of anyone investigating these kind of fires. So that goes, there are arson investigators, fire investigators, as crime scene personnel, and firefighters, of course, there as well at the beginning of it. And so you have to be very aware of the health and safety risks that are involved in these kind of fires. So any kind of unsafe structures that might at any stage topple on top of you if they haven't been secured. Also looking at noxious substances that might be in the inside the building material. Like, there's still a lot of asbestos around in some of the
Right.
houses and buildings. So you have to be very much aware of that. And then really the main difficulty can be to assess where the remains are, first of all, and once you have found them, the approach of how to remove them from that scenario without compromising any evidence that's there. Particularly in house fires, there could be all kinds of debris on top of the bodies, of the remains. It's usually all, if there's a wall that, or the walls have been plastered, that's coming off. That's usually on top of the remains. The upper floor, if there is one, has come down. The
Hmm.
roof has come down. There might be tiles there as well. So there is all kinds of material there. And also a lot of material like insulation material and plastics that during the fire have changed their appearance and can very much mimic certain human remains, particularly bones. And so they have to be sorted, of course, and make sure that you retrieve all the human remains that are there down to the smallest parts. Other problems can be if there were any kind of pets in the house as well. So you have to maybe a mixture of human and non-human remains that have to be separated first, and then later on, if you have done the job to your best possibility, then you shouldn't have too much difficulty later on in the mortuary to actually reassemble and reconcile these remains for examination.
Right. So I have a question. I was just thinking about a game with you, so that if I give you a bone, if I said finger bones or something like this, what can you tell from, if somebody, because obviously maybe not all the time you end up with the complete skeleton, but if you
That's
have
right.
small pieces, if you end up with just a few of the finger bones, what can you tell from, these few fragments or these few pieces?
Well, it very much depends on what you have available. There are methods out there, and I mean, you have to see this as a multidisciplinary approach as well. So I'm not working in a vacuum when I work as a forensic anthropologist, and I'm not trying to. What I want is as much expertise and opinion as possible to work from different specialties to work on this. And so there's a lot of work that goes hand in hand with the DNA specialists as well in the forensic science lab. So I suppose if I had something like the fingerbones, the first thing I would look at then is, are there any suspicious injury marks there? Are there any injuries marked that might not even be suspicious, but that might be what we call antemortem, that occurred a long time before death? So maybe some broken fingers that have healed in particular areas. That might be helpful later on to identify someone with the medical records available. But for suspicious marks, I mean, the fingers are particularly useful if you have projectiles penetrating that area. There might be a mark left on the bones, but also particularly in sharp force injuries, so defense wounds on the inside of the fingers. So while the soft tissue might have now gone in the fire, you can still, if there are deep wounds, and some of these defensive wounds are very deep because people are fighting for their lives, they go down to the bone, and you can actually identify these marks on the finger bones. So though you know something happened here that is highly suspicious, that didn't occur just because of the fire. So that's why it is vitally important that we do everything we can, not only from a human point of view, from a humanity point of view, that we try to remove and retrieve all the human remains that are there, so to make sure that there's nothing left behind that later goes into a landfill or rubbish tip or something like that, but also that we do everything to maximize the potential for evidence retrieval, and any kind of trauma to the hands, of course, would be part of the evidence. So yeah, that would come to mind when you talk about finger bones or fragments of finger bones. There are some research papers out there, some articles that have developed methods like using discriminant functions again on identifying maybe the biological sex of the person by measuring the finger bones. But we have something better. If they are not too damaged by fire, if the heat hasn't damaged them too much, the possibility of DNA retrieval should be used to identify the sex properly in these cases, particularly if you don't have anything else from the body. But it would be rare to just have the finger bones and have nothing else there, unless you have a place where someone burned just hand, or just put amputated limbs or something in a place and try to get rid of them. So we should have some other indicators. But so finger bones, while they are limited, they can still give us a lot of information, and of course they can give us information about the approximate age at death. Particularly if it's a younger individual, we should still be able to see then development center, growth centers, and if it's an older adult, well, then of course the age range will be quite wide, but at least we can have a look at it.
Right. So which bone, for example, if you had a choice, which of the bones in the human body are the most informative?
Well, for biological sex, first and foremost is the pelvis. Because the pelvis is designed by nature to be what we call sexually dimorphic, to be different between the sexes. I'm using biological sex and not gender, because gender is a completely different construct. So we're talking really about the biological sex here. That's the only thing that we can identify or estimate. We cannot look at the other issues of gender, but we have a look at biological sex. So yes, definitely the pelvis, and there are also very good age markers on the pelvis to a certain degree, up to a certain age. The skull as a second, but the skull is not designed to be sexually dimorphic as such. So it relies a lot on muscle attachments and how strong these are. So robusticity and gracility of the skull really depends on muscle mass, but that can vary from person to person and from, of course, between the sexes as well. So for aging, very good. You have the teeth that you can use, if the teeth are there, of course. In other areas, depending on, again, up to a certain age, maybe the clavicles might be very useful.
Hmm.
They can give us a good indication of development up into a certain adult age. So yes, if you have a long bone, particularly the femur or the thigh bone, or also the tibia, the chin bone, you can estimate the living stature of the possible living stature, but there's always an age range or a stature range involved here. It's never exactly say that this person is 5'6" or was 5'6". That's why we call it estimation. So we give a range. If you get a single number, a single stature estimation, then I think I would question that if that was in there. So it's always a range depending on the standard deviations. Yeah, I suppose so. So if you have a skull, if you have the pelvis, and you have a long bone, you can already say pretty much a lot about the person.
Okay, interesting. So the skull, for example, like you've done some research. You have some publications where you looked at both, I believe, sex determination and I think age-related estimations on. Yeah. So what part of the skull are you actually looking at? Okay, because I mean, there's so much to it. I mean,
there's so much to it, and I picked the base of the skull, which is just there where your neck starts to attach. It's on the underside, the foramen magnum, exactly there, the big hole there. That's called the foramen magnum. And on either side to the front, left and right, you have exactly the occipital condyles. So I investigated this region for the possibility of identifying the sex using the discriminant function and logistic regression analysis, just in case of fragmentary remains. And I used the British population for this because it was the closest population to me here. In Ireland, we don't have a documented collection of skeletal remains, that means of known sex and age. And so I had to travel to the UK for the closest collection. So yeah, I used that region because at the time when I did most of the other parts of the skull, which maybe some people might find more interesting, particularly the face and the jawbone, the lower jawbone, they have been researched so much. And now, looking back now, I know the cranial base has been researched very much. But at the time when I did it, there were only a few researchers in the US who did some work on it. And then there were some researchers who did it not for forensic purposes, but for clinical purposes, for surgical access to the cranial base and the contents there. So at that time, it was just the area I was very interested in that, and also it's developmentally it's a very it's not a very safe area. It's a very fragile area. A lot can happen in that area, so it's quite interesting from a developmental point of view as well.
Interesting. Yeah, in 2010, I went to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and that one was in Seattle at the time. And there was her name was Dr. Ann Ross. And
yes.
she had presented on geometric morphometrics, and she had a researcher with her from, I think it was the University of Buffalo at the time, but I was really fascinated with what they were talking about because they kind of gave some examples. Could you describe in maybe just simple terms what morphometrics is and how it helps in forensic anthropology?
I haven't used geometric morphometrics yet, but I have, you could say, dabbled in it a bit, of course, for my own understanding and also for possible use in cases now. In my case, the morphometric analysis, it very simply, very simple put, and I might, some people will also correct me on this, I'm sure, but let's say you take certain measurements on the skull and you want to identify the sex of the skull, and you put these linear measurements into a formula that has been devised to separate the sexes. So these are linear measurements. They capture a certain kind of range within the skull, but also they capture a certain type or a certain amount of shape within the skull, but not really. So what geometric morphometric does, for example, is it takes a lot of landmarks on the skull rather than linear measurements. And it captures the shape by using these landmarks, and it then, when we talk about shape, yes, we can describe shape as, this is round, this is elongated, this is, whatever it might be, but this geometric morphometric tries to capture it statistically, and it will use statistics to separate or to compare shapes within a shape space. And so it is a completely new, or it's a completely different approach than just linear measurements and the analysis of these measurements, because now we are looking at the shape, we are discarding size, and we are looking at shape and the differences that shape might bring between the sexes or between different geographic populations and so on. So it's quite a very interesting approach, definitely. And I have read and research, and I'm very aware of their computer program that they're using. So I'm hopefully that at some stage I can actually make use of it once I have a case that includes virtual reconstructions of skulls as well.
Okay. Yeah. So if I understand correctly, then it's not just, looking at the nasal aperture size. Like, it's not about how many millimeters. It's about the relationship between all these different points and how they sort of fit together, let's say. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You also had a paper that I wanted to ask you about, which had to do with Nonmarks, rodent anthropological analysis of extensive rodent Nonmarks on human skull using postmortem multi-slice CT. It's a mouthful.
That's a mouthful. Yeah. Jesus, yeah.
It's a really interesting topic, actually, because I know that there are many cases, for example, in the US where, like along the border of Mexico, where you have wide open spaces and, people go missing, and then, they're left for scavenging or whatever. And then there actually was a case that somebody came up in a case that I was sort of associated with, and it had to do with whether markings on a skull were from a sharp metal object or whether it was just scavenging. And I'm curious about, do you have any comment on how extensive the literature is, or how well forensic anthropologists know about these different things?
Well, from a literature point of view, yes, there's certainly there's quite a lot. First of all, what you mentioned, my article is actually a case report, just it's concerns a single skull, and but there's research out there. There are books, in particular books that covering forensic taphonomy, and these kind of areas. They usually contain very good chapters on animal scavenging and the marks they leave. And there are, of course, articles. There are lots and lots of articles on scavenging and the different marks out there. Yes, it's pretty well covered. It of course continues because there's so much out there that can leave marks on the bones, apart from all the different rodents and so on. And it goes back also to your knowledge of your geographic region, of your environment that you work in, because you only have a certain fauna in your geographic area. So only certain animals appear in your area that don't appear maybe in other geographic regions, and vice versa. So you have to be very much aware what you might be dealing with here in your environment, in your forensic environment, and that might be able to leave marks on these bones and what these marks look like. And it also gives you a good idea of why the marks have been left. So, for example, when the marks were left on the bone might have a very important indication of the post-mortem interval, when the remains were accessed by the different animals, because some animals might just go for the fatty content of the bones when there's still fatty content there, or also the soft tissue that might still remain, while other animals might go just for any kind of calcium that they might get out of the bones, and also not only for nutrition, but also very just simply as a tool. There are rodents that use bones to wear down their teeth, their incisors, because their incisors are continually growing and they always have to wear them down. So they use bones for that purpose as well. But for that purpose, then the bones have to be already lost. They have to have lost their soft tissue, so they have to have been lying there for quite a while other marks on the bones might have occurred around the time that the body was deposited there, So it gives a lot of information. It's not just, oh, these are gnaw marks and we can separate them from any suspicious other marks, but they give us information about the timing of when the remains might have been placed there, or, when someone or some remains have been left there, and also for how long they might have been in that area. And it's similar to marine animals, for example. When you look at marine life, there's different ways of how fleshed remains or remains with soft tissue are attacked, so to speak, by the marine animals. And then later on, when they are, I call it just bones, what might attach to them at that stage. And you also know then, depending on certain barnacles, for example, the different species maybe of barnacles in your areas, and certain ones only attach or come to live in a certain depth afterwards. So you might know that bone must have been at a certain depth at some stage. And so there's lots of extra knowledge that you bring in, but you have to be very careful of how you interpret it, because in the end something can go to court and you have to be very aware of the forensic process. So while I can identify these marks and I can comment on them, I would not go past my expertise, that to talk about the life cycle or anything else about these kind of fauna or animals. That would be for another expert to comment on.
Right. Yeah, I had her name was Dr. Paola Magni from she's in Australia right now, but she's talking about underwater forensics. That was pretty fascinating too. So let me ask you another question, and that is, I'm not a forensic anthropologist, but at the University of Toronto where I teach, a lot of students coming into like my course or whatever are from a anthropology background. And one of the things I found fascinating early on, and my background is engineering, so for me it's like numbers and it's that sort of thing. So they would say things like this is smooth, or this is rough, or this is, and they would describe things. But then, and I would always wonder about, well, how do you make that a more objective assessment? And so I'm wondering if in forensic anthropology there is, there's sort of still this aspect, and are there any has there been a move towards more objective analysis and different types of analysis?
Yeah, that's certainly still an aspect of forensic anthropology where your descriptive analysis plays a role. And yes, it can be, while there are guidelines out there that you learn over time, and the books that will guide you, and then the courses that will guide you, and the only time that you can actually get a better grasp of, when you're talking about a rough or porous surface, maybe of a skull, or of a certain anatomical landmark on the pelvis and so on, and how these changes can be described of the surface, maybe with age and so on, that comes with experience. I don't think it is possible just to go out there fresh and with the book in your hand and describe these changes, and get very frustrated at the beginning because I said, what do they mean? What if I feel this, that's still smooth to me, and I would interpret this as rough, or is it slightly billowed, is this moderately billowed, is it heavily billowed? All these kind of, you learn in your courses and so on, but the more you analyze, the more you investigate, that it comes with the experience, and that can be a very problematic issue as well, because obviously as students, how are you going to get the experience, because you're not really coming out, you're not really have access to actual casework, so you have to learn from maybe collections and teaching collections that might be out there, and that if you have a good teaching collection, then yes, it can cover a broad spectrum of these kind of changes. But yeah, they're definitely part of still, I mean, our observed changes, morphological changes,
Hmm.
and we try as best as possible to back up the first impressions of, for example, biological sex, of age at death, and so on, with statistical methods. At the very least, with statistical methods. But there is a lot of work to do to bring more and more of these observed traits and aspects to into trying to quantify it somehow and trying to make it more science.
Right, right, right.
To but it's so it's there. There are research they're trying and they're doing it, but we are certainly still relying also very much on observed and first impressions and so on. But I think that comes with more experience you have, the more you can rely on your instincts in that. But to make absolutely sure, you also want to back it up with some method that you can use that is based on the statistics, that is based on peer-reviewed science that
Right.
has been used before, it has been accepted, and particularly has a known bias and error that you can actually incorporate into your analysis.
Right. What would you say right now is like a controversial topic in forensic anthropology? Is there more than one? Maybe, I don't know, but is there anything today that's sort of like a hot topic in the, I don't hang out with anthropologists, so I don't know, but you
Well,
probably do.
Well, I'm not sure about forensic anthropology as such. There is there might be one topic now that of course concerns a whole range of anthropologists, going into biological anthropology and cultural anthropology as well, but particularly in biological, or in the past physical anthropology and forensic anthropology, is the question of what is at the moment termed ancestry or ethnicity, and how you define this. It has the whole kind of connotation of race and race research that was actually carried out by physical anthropologists in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So, of course, that has given it a very, very bad name. And now the whole discussions are about, well, how do we still serve, particularly in forensics, how do we still serve the investigative authorities by providing them with as much detail as we can about the person or the individual that we are examining. We have to give them all the information, but how do we term this? How do we describe these changes between different geographic populations, and also within, changes particularly within the same population? Because there's many more changes occurring, what we call interpolation, so within the population, than actually between people from other places. So there's
Right.
minor changes, but they're more, they're quantitatively higher. So that is, I think, a big topic in forensic anthropology. And I don't know, there have been very good papers out there to try to solve this. Now, I cannot speak for the archaeological or historical part. That's not my area. So they probably have to try and solve it for themselves as well. But definitely for forensics, we need to get it done so that we can continue providing law enforcement and other investigators, the coroners, and colleagues in neighboring specialties like forensic pathology and odontology, and so that we can come up with a terminology that everyone understands,
Right.
but that is removed from what was happening in the past.
Right, for sure. Hey, I want to bring something up here because you posted this just a few days ago, and I thought it was really interesting. But unfortunately, you have to be in Ireland apparently to watch this thing.
Yes,
So Ireland's Identified Bodies. It looks like it's a mini series
yes,
with
4 parts.
4 parts. Okay, what can you tell us about it? It sounds exciting.
Well, it's a program that was made just over the last year or so. Of course, during some problematic times when we look at COVID and everything, involved. But it's a program that highlights the issues of missing persons in Ireland, and particularly unidentified remains that that we either still have, maybe buried in some graveyards, or that might still be in a laboratory somewhere, and also any unidentified remains that are occurring now, that are coming to our attention now. So it gives a very good insight into some of the older cases that are still open, that most people here in Ireland would be familiar with and would follow quite a good bit, and also about the technologies that we use at the moment nowadays to try to identify these remains. And particularly there's an emphasis on the forensic anthropology, human identification, forensic DNA part, and also forensic odontology. But it very much gives a form also to there's families of the missing who are very much at the forefront here and talking about their experiences also with the system that is in place, and maybe some of the comments on how it could be advanced, and also talking to the different investigative authorities, the Irish police, An Garda Síochána, and the different officers involved in these cases, and their impressions of at the time when the case came along, and maybe in some cases what they look at now, how they look back at the case that's 20 years old and still not solved. Right. So it covers a whole range of very well-known cases here in Ireland that go back maybe 30 years. Or that are as recent as 10 years or 5 years ago.
Oh, that's excellent. Hey, do you mind taking a couple of questions? There were a couple of questions here from some of the people here.
Yeah.
All right. This is James Locke. Hi, James, and welcome from Texas. He asked, what types of photography, infrared, UV, micro, or even SCM is used in looking for direct contact and to quantify damage or mechanism? So I guess he's asking about, you mentioned just now about different types of equipment that are used in anthropology, and what can you comment on that?
Well, first of all, here forensic anthropology is not part of any university system. So it's not taught in university. There's definitely bioarchaeology, osteoarchaeology, all this, but not forensic anthropology as such. So I'm a practitioner. I'm a forensic practitioner, so I don't have the support, the technical support that a university would have or that an institute would have. So I have to very simply just work with the normal camera. And I have what you call it, like an online or computer small microscope that I can use for surface analysis as well. So these are my only instruments. And if you talk about camera, maybe for internal structures, if it's mummified, or also to look without trying to damage anything inside the skull, so I use a small endoscopic camera as well. So maybe these three things: an endoscopic camera, your normal digital camera, and what I mentioned there. God, now I forgot it.
Well, I guess depending on
little microscope, yes.
But I mean, if you have, I mean, there's different tools obviously for different jobs, and it sounds like an SEM or any of these things could be applicable depending on the situation, right? So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you have, as I said, I just don't have access to it, so I have to, and that's, I think, with practitioners here who are consultants and a consultancy basis that are not linked to any institution or agency that's falling here under the Department of Justice. We just have to rely on what we can actually afford ourselves, and unfortunately that's then limited. But we can make use. We have good contacts, for example, in areas of like if you need CT scan or a X-ray or so, that's possible.
Right.
But that's not something I would carry around with me, obviously.
Okay, of course. Jose from Mexico, he's asking if there's an international guide to treat human remains in mass graves.
I think there's a most recent one, I think, that came out from Bournemouth University, and now don't ask me the exact title, but I'm very happy to find out for you. I have it somewhere. It's very recent, and I'd be more than happy to pass it on. I just forgot the title of it, but as far as I remember, it has been researched and published by the colleagues in Bournemouth University.
Right. Okay. And we have another one. This is Stijn Bloemen from Belgium, and he's asking, what's the framework for cooperation with judicial authorities? So I'm assuming he means they're in Ireland.
In Ireland, well, for anthropology, we have just been. I've been trying for some years to get forensic anthropology, but not only anthropology, on a wider range, forensic human identification in-house, so to speak, here. So alongside the other services under the Department of Justice, like the State Pathologist Service, there's the Coroner Service, there's the Police Service, the Garda Síochána, for example. There's Forensic Science Ireland, the laboratories that carries out analysis in trace analysis and DNA work, for example. But we are not there yet, unfortunately. So in the meantime, what I have managed to do with a colleague is to set up a forensic anthropology service proposal that we started with the State Pathologist Office and with the Coroner Service of Ireland in November 2019. And that's to provide certain services and a 24/7 rota system of availability to the authorities here if the coroners if they want to use forensic anthropology at the scene, or if they're just happy with forensic pathology, that's absolutely fine. But we have seen since then a definite increase in casework that came our way, and a lot of cases also that came from the Irish police that we still haven't yet covered with a more formal agreement. But we have with the coroners and with the pathologists, we have at least some kind of formal agreement in place.
Okay.
If there's any more, if you need any more insight into that, I'd be more than happy to do that privately via email or chat online or something like that.
All right. Hey, yeah, we're getting on a little bit of time here, so I'm just going to ask you maybe one or two quick questions. So first off, or one of the big ones here is, what is next for Dr. René Gapert? What are you working on? That's sort of the next big thing for you going forward.
Right. So at the moment, I continue fighting for getting this service recognized and used more, and hopefully, as I mean, if you look at it, we are not getting a salary for this. We are getting a fee which is very restricted by the Coroners Act, and this is very much a vocation. You cannot earn enough to earn a living. It's very difficult to say that, but that's what it is. And we are trying to do a lot in that area. So it would be a great help if we had a way of being even able to apply for positions here that would allow us to work in that area. So that's continuing that fight. So we have brought that on. We were in contact with different politicians, and we have brought it to the Irish government before. So we are still there talking to them. Otherwise, what I've started at the moment is because there are two main projects in my mind. One is with colleagues from the Irish police, looking at the establishment of a fatal fire or fire death investigation course or workshop for the Irish police, but also for maybe other professionals who work in fire investigation and come across fatal fire deaths. That is at the moment in the planning stage, and we are hoping to have that advanced pretty much very soon. The other project is I've linked up with what's called here an organization, Clean Coasts. Clean Coasts in Ireland they are a group that is looking voluntarily after the Irish coastline, after the beaches and the other areas around the Irish coastline, to keep them clean. So they are organizing a lot of voluntary groups who will clean and keep the beaches clean. They organize monthly cleanups, a big annual cleanup, and so on. And I've linked up with them to. We are starting to implement the possibility of a bone identification system, where we now hope with these volunteer groups that can cover a much larger area of Ireland, and particularly of the coast, than we could here, to collect images and report all bones or potential bones and remains that are found within the forensic system, so that they are not discarded. Oh, this might be just a bit of rubbish here, this might be just a bit of animal or non-human bone, but that everything is actually entered into a forensic system, that we examine everything, and that we can then either rule in or rule out that this is something of interest. Particularly, we have quite a good number of bodies coming in from the sea, from the water. So it makes sense. And having linked up and spoken to some of the family members of the missing, I think they saw it as a very good idea as well. A little bit of comfort that there are people out there looking and reporting these finds rather than disregarding them.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea, actually. That's good on you. I hope you're successful with that. Is it okay if I show your LinkedIn profile in case people want to contact you?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, here. So I'll just show this here, and if you want to get hold of Dr. Gapert, let me see if I can just put this into the comments here in case anyone is interested. And yeah, put that over there. Also, I will share, he's given me permission before, but I can share his email address as well if you want to get a hold of him through his company. René, listen, I want to say thanks so much. It's really great information. You can tell you're really passionate about what you're doing, which is fantastic. And I appreciate all the knowledge and all the help you've given me here today.
Thank you very much, Eugene. It was my pleasure. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you and your audience. And as you said, the contact details are there. If you have any questions at all, I'll be more than happy to, for you to contact me. We can get in touch, and we'll have a chat either via email or online or whatever. We find a way.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Hang back here. I'm just going to make some closing announcements, and we'll catch up. All right. Thanks. All right, folks. Well, that does it for this episode. Some great information there. Yeah, we went on a little bit. Lots to talk about there. Again, just in closing, don't forget that the Forensic Photography Symposium was just announced today. So it's brand new. It's out there. If you're interested in getting on there and just having a look, registration is not open yet, but there is a pre-registration form if you're interested. Just head over to the main website. It'll lead you right to where you need to go. You fill out the form, and you will be good to go. All right. Well, look, that does it for this one. I want to say thanks to everybody here. Some great questions, and people from South America and overseas and everything. That's fantastic. I love it when we get the international audience here. Wish everyone a great day, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.